Hi, if you're like me, you bought a MIDI keyboard at some point and got a free license to Ableton Live Lite, opened it up, and were immediately scared off by the endless options, views, and icons. Like, why are there 3 or 4 different types of record buttons? Or what do all the icons mean? Or how do the session and arrangement work together? Now, if you were to tell me to read the manual, I'd tell you no thank you very much, because that's over 700 pages. Luckily, I went ahead and did that for you, and every time I figured out something I wish I had known when I first opened up Ableton Live, I wrote it down, and the result is this video. I'll start with the big stuff up front and then talk about some fun little things, and my goal here isn't a comprehensive Ableton tutorial, but rather just the stuff that I found a little bit more difficult and non-obvious, at least to me anyway. Let's get started. Probably the biggest obstacle to understanding Ableton Live is the fact that there are 2 separate places that you can record music into and play it back from, the session and the arrangement, and how the 2 relate to each other. Now, you can toggle between the 2 by clicking here or pressing tab, but somehow to me, that even made things more confusing as an early user. I think the best way to avoid this confusion as an early user is to open the second window and put them side by side. When you're starting out, you don't need the extra screen real estate for tracks, but you do need to understand the interplay between the 2 views. Plus, adding a second window gives you the advantage of seeing both the clip and device views when you drill down into specific clips. More on these 2 in a bit, but first let's start by understanding the session and the arrangement. And for that, I'll start out with a new live set and just clear stuff out a bit so that we can see things more cleanly. I'll load up a simple piano here. Now, just in terms of live basics, there are 2 types of tracks, MIDI tracks and audio tracks. I'll start with just one simple MIDI track, and in order to hear what I play on the keyboard, the track needs to be armed. Now, you'll notice first thing that when I arm a track, it's armed both in the session and the arrangement. Before I show you how to record into either the session or the arrangement, let's understand the difference between the 2. They aren't 2 views and they aren't modes, but rather they coexist all at the same time, even if you only use one of them. The arrangement is the easier one to understand. All DAWs work like this in a linear fashion. It's basically like a multi-track tape, where every row represents a track that can store music or process either MIDI or audio. To create a song, you gradually add or record clips onto the timeline, and when you're done, the song plays from start to finish the same way every time. The session, on the other hand, is the more powerful part of Ableton Live, and it lives in parallel to the arrangement. The idea here is that MIDI and audio clips live on a grid, and you can play any one of them anytime you like. You can quickly put ideas together by recording a clip, and then another one, and you can easily switch between one and the other without being committed to a rigid timeline. Session View treats songs like pieces of Lego that you can move around. Each column or group of columns represents an instrument, and each cell represents a loop or part that you can play. If I load up a slightly more expansive project, so this is a slightly busier project, and you can see that I can pick the, let's say, hi-hats from this row, and the bass line from this row, and the drums from here. Or if I want, I can trigger entire parts of a song or scenes by pressing the scene button over here. I can move from section to section. Let's say this is a bridge. Right. Then move on to the next section, and so on. If you do plan to use Session View actively, I highly recommend you get a grid-based controller. Akai and Novation make good ones with an 8x8 or 8x5 grid, and there are a few manufacturers that make keyboards like this one with built-in views into the grid. This is an 8x2 view into the grid, and you can scroll up and down to see different sections of the grid. Most of these will also let you move left and right, select tracks, and trigger entire scenes by pressing these buttons over here. So I think this is really nice and pretty easy to understand, but I think what is the most interesting or difficult to wrap your head around is how the session and arrangement work together. And like I said before, while putting them side by side does make things a little bit busier, I think that in terms of learning, it's a really good way to go. So again, to simplify, I'll start a new project and clear things up a bit. Make sure to arm this track and bring in my piano again. So now, even though I've armed my track and it's visibly armed in both the arrangement and the session, I can only record into one of them in any given time. The slightly confusing part is that as I add more tracks, this can apply to tracks on an individual basis. But let's start out with one. When a track is active in the session, it's disabled in the arrangement. So I just recorded this little clip here into the session, and nothing was recorded into the arrangement. This track is grayed out on the arrangement, and if I hit this play button, I can make the arrangement be the active one, and now the session is grayed out. So if I wanted to, I could record into the arrangement. Right? And now I have a clip. Let's zoom into it a little bit. Over here on my arrangement, which is a completely different clip than my clip here in the session. I can change this, let's say, into a minor chord. Right? Notice how the arrangement became inactive. And if I make it active again, click here to play this. That's my major chord. A completely different clip than from the arrangement. So let's take a look at this again in the more complex project. Let's take this one, for example. Notice here, all 4 tracks are not active in the arrangement, and they are active in the session. I can activate tracks in the arrangement one by one, or just hit this back to arrangement button, either here or here, and make the arrangement the only active part of live. So if I play my song here, you won't hear anything. But if I activate the tracks here, and I can do that with this button, this activates all the tracks in the session and disables them in the arrangement, I can start playing either individual tracks or entire scenes from the session. So that's how you determine which tracks are active. And the arrangement and the session both have 4 tracks, but obviously with extremely different content. Recording into the arrangement requires a track to be armed and active, and then you can hit record. Recording into the session requires it to be armed as well, but you press this record button rather than this one. Okay, so we know how to record content into the arrangement, and we know how to record content into the session, and we can just jam out here all day. But if we want to commit our session to the arrangement, when we hit record when these tracks aren't active in the arrangement, then anything played here will be sent to the arrangement. Let's try that out. So I can hit record, and obviously hitting your record here or here is the same thing. Right, you can see this track is being recorded onto the arrangement. I can move on to this one, this one, this one, back here. So that's one way to commit a jam or to record whatever you're doing here into the arrangement. Now, as long as these tracks are grayed out, we won't hear them. So if I hit stop and play, right, we're not hearing anything because these aren't active. Of course, I can go ahead, activate them, and now my song is playing here. Another way to move scenes from the session to the arrangement is literally to grab a scene and to drag it onto the arrangement. A neat trick to move clips from the session to the arrangement, if you're working with one window, is to grab the scene and just move it through here onto the arrangement. Let's go back to 2 screens for a little bit more. Now, one of the things that might confuse you as you build out your track is that the session can't run standalone. So the minute you play something here, the arrangement is moving forward as well. That might surprise you in pleasant or unpleasant ways as you jam out here. And that's why I think it's also a good reason to start using Live in this split screen mode. Another little tidbit about the arrangement: playback will always start from the playback start point over here. Right? Hit stop, hit play again. It's always going to go back to here. I can change that by clicking anywhere and hitting play. Now playback will start from this point every time. Double click moves it to the beginning. And if I want to resume from the previous playback position, I hold Shift and space. Okay, so that's how you record onto the session, record onto the arrangement, record from the session to the arrangement. Let's talk about overdubbing, or adding to a clip once it's already recorded. This is where audio clips behave differently than MIDI clips. Generally speaking, you cannot overdub an audio clip or a sample unless you're using the looper device, and we won't talk about that in this clip. Let me know in the comment section if you want me to make a dedicated clip about that, because that's a story on its own. But again, no overdubbing on audio clips. However, with MIDI clips, you can record over them or add notes to them. Now here too, there's a difference between the session and the arrangement. I'll start with a new clean project again. So we already know how to record. In the session, you overdub by turning on the session record button. Now, if I were to take this clip, put it onto the arrangement, and zoom in, if I were to activate this and hit record, I would play over these notes. Let me undo that. Overdubbing in the arrangement requires me to hit this button, and then I can safely record on top of this chord. And that's how you overdub MIDI in the arrangement. The next thing that might be slightly confusing about Ableton is the fact that every track has an associated device view and multiple clip views. Here again, you can work with just one window. So let's take a look, for example, at this track. It's a MIDI track. This is its device view, or the list of devices that it has, and I can either click an individual clip to see its clip view, or toggle the two using these tabs over here. If I work with two windows, I'll see both at the same time. And I can move them around like this, or with Shift tab. The clip view lets you see the details of the MIDI or audio clip you're working on, and the device view lets you see which instruments and effects live in your track. So for example, in this session, this clip, right, plays these notes, in this case a simple chord, and it's affected by a MIDI effect, the arpeggiator, and it is this instrument. And then I've got a few effects on top. Working this way with two views, by the way, lets you put a piano roll over here and make it as big as you like. I can take these guys away. Pretty nice canvas for working with notes in parallel to your session. So let's take a closer look at editing clips, and again, to simplify, I'll start with a new simple set. When you either record a clip or just create it by double clicking here, this might seem a little bit confusing. It certainly was to me initially. Let me explain what's going on. And just to get us started, I will add a few notes onto the timeline. And just like the rest of this video, my goal isn't to explain every single feature, but rather just those that I don't think are very intuitive. So one of the things that baffled me in the beginning was why there are two sets of arrows here. The top set define the loop, so I can make the loop shorter if I like. And then the bottom two arrows represent start and end points. So the loop may go on, say, from, let's say, here to here, but you can choose to start the loop here, in which case it would sound like this. Clips don't have to loop, by the way. You can just have them play once. And then these start and end points will just define the start and end points of the one-shot clip. All this applies, by the way, to audio loops as well. So if I go in here and just drag this guy in, same thing here with loop points. course, the start as well. Now you can also loop clips in the arrangement, but that works differently. If I use the little trick I showed you before and drag this through here onto the arrangement, and then zoom in a little bit, loop points here will determine how the sample loops as I stretch it out. And notice these little ticks here represent the loop point. If I change the loop length here, it will impact what's going on in the timeline as well. Okay, let's talk about these boxes here. And arrangement clips have 3 of them, and session clips have 4 of them. The launch box is what makes session clips special. And then the clip, launch, and envelopes repeat themselves for both MIDI and audio tracks, and sample control or note control is what makes them different. The clip box is always visible, and you can hide the others by clicking here. So if you need more space to edit the notes on your clip, you can do it like this. Now you can make more room for a clip like I showed you before by doing this, but there's also a nice little trick. By clicking the fold button, you can only show the notes that are active. This is particularly useful for clips with percussion. You can add notes by just double clicking, or if you enter draw mode, you can just click to add notes. I'll undo this. And if you click these little headphones, you can hear notes as you add them or as you drag them around, including groups of notes. Whoops. Groups of notes. Jazz. These little lines here are velocity controls, which you can either move individually or together. Now, another non-obvious feature when recording notes, if I just erase everything here, you can enter notes into a sequence by playing them using a MIDI keyboard. As long as you have preview enabled, you can select the spot where you want to enter the notes and then play whatever you want and hit the right key to add that chord. And you can keep doing this wherever you want. I will clean this up and start out with a new clip. A nice feature of Live is that you can edit multiple clips at the same time. So if I were to select both of these clips, I can now see the notes in both clips, move from one to the other. If I change their color, by the way, then you'll see that reflected here as well. I've got to select only one. And now I can edit both clips together and move the notes of whichever of the two I want to change. This works in the arrangement too, by the way. Okay, let me delete these and this guy. Now, another feature you want to be aware of when you're working with samples is whether warp is active or not. So let's go into all the clip boxes here. By default, Ableton will attempt to warp or to adjust a clip's internal tempo to the tempo of your project. So this loop, for example, is in 118 BPM, and so is my track. But if I adjust the speed of my track, Ableton will attempt to warp or adapt the clip to the tempo of my project, and it has a few ways of doing this. The best being Complex Pro, especially for musical loops like this one. You can tell the difference in quality. This algorithm is obviously adapted to beats. And these unfortunately don't exist in Live Lite, but certainly something you should be aware of, that when you drag a loop into your project and warp is on, it's not going to play back in the tempo that it was originally recorded. Now, if it bugs you that Live tries to warp your samples by default, you can change that in the preferences. We'll get to that in a bit. Another non-obvious but important feature I wanted to talk about is follow actions, and I'll just touch on this briefly. The idea is, let me just take this clip and paste it here, and maybe transpose it a little bit. Right, so I've got these two clips. I can move between them by hitting play. Right. But what if I just wanted them to do that without me hitting play every time? Well, that's what follow actions are for. Again, I won't go into this in detail, but the idea is that you can choose to, let's say in this case, play the next clip in the track And here I'll want to play the previous clip in the track. And then once I hit play, you can see that it's moving from one to the other without me touching anything. There's also an element of randomness here. I won't go into this in detail, but I think that follow actions is one of those little Ableton features that is important to know about. Okay, let's move on. I'll delete this track and create a simple clip. The next big and slightly unobvious topic I want to talk about is automation or envelopes. And for that, I will add one return track, and I'll go into the audio effects and put a reverb on it. Let's say this one. So this is my basic track. Now, as I play it, I could change some of the parameters. I can send it to the reverb. I can mess around with the panning. If you have a controller, you could also do that, right, with the controls. But what if I wanted to automate or to do these things in the software rather than doing it manually? So there are two ways to do that. I can either record these motions or draw them in manually. Let's start with the easier one, which is drawing them in manually. In the session view, you do that in the envelopes box right here, right? So you can move between notes and envelopes, and notice that in notes I see the actual notes, and sort of when I'm in the envelopes I see their little shadow over here. I need to pick the parameter that I want to edit within the group that I want to edit, but an easier way to do that is just to touch it over here. So I could edit the send or the track pan. Let's start with the send. So what if I wanted to send just this note out to the reverb? So see this little line here? I could just take it and drop it to nothing on these three notes, and then, well, maybe move this around here, then have it increase over here. And now let's take a listen. Notice? Just these two notes, especially this one, is getting some reverb love. Notice also, as I added automation to the send, this little LED lights up here as well as over here. Let's automate the panning as well. Let's do something wild here. Let's say, take this over here, and then, yeah, have this play here, and then have this play back here. Let's hear what this sounds like. Right, pretty crazy, but you get the idea. You could also use the draw tool for this. So just draw away like this. And if I wanted smoother lines, I could remove the fixed grid. B, by the way, is the shortcut for this tool. And then if you hold Option, probably Alt on a PC, you could sort of stretch these curves like this. As you take these clips, you can copy them into the arrangement, just like we did before. And then this little icon shows you the automation, right? So we copied it with the automation for the reverb and the pan. If you want in the arrangement, you can also split these automations out and look at them separately. So let's go back to the session. That is how you draw these automations. Let's talk about recording them. So if I wanted to manually record the pan using a knob, notice how as I move the knob, this little line here moves as well. Now to record automation, you need to click this little thing here. And then if I go ahead and click Session Overdub, then I can change the automation manually. Now notice that the minute I let this go into the next loop, it's going to erase the automation, so I need to just stop moving my hand a little bit before. And now I've got nice pan automation. Automation in the arrangement is a little bit different. You need to turn this on, the MIDI arrangement overdub, as well as this guy, and then make sure to not have your track armed, otherwise the MIDI notes will be erased. Then just hit record. And then you can record as you wish, just like this. One final nice trick about automation loops is that they don't need to be as long as your MIDI loop. So this is 1 bar, and if I go into my envelopes and unclick linked, I can go ahead and make my automation loop as long or as short as I want. Let's do some wild panning here. This is a really nice way to create your own custom LFO or low frequency oscillator or modulator for any parameter you want. While we're on the topic of automations, there's one last thing that I wanted to discuss. You can easily automate any of the parameters that Live opens up in, let's say, this device or any other device. These are all accessible with automation. But what you might find is as you go to look at third-party plugins, you don't have access to a lot of the parameters that you can change over here, like, for example, any one of these. They're not visible by default as modulation destinations or automation destinations with plugins like this one that have more than 64 destinations. The way you enable them for MIDI or external control, and I'll just resize this guy a little bit so we have more room, is you go in here into this little branch here, make sure that the plugin is visible, and then expand this, click configure, and then just click the parameters. Notice how they're getting added here that you want to add as modulatable destinations, as automatable destinations. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and close out your plugin, and then these will be available to either automate or map out using MIDI mapping to external controllers like this one. So let's say, for example, I'll map this parameter to this knob, and this guy over here, and this guy over here, and this guy over here. And as I exit MIDI mapping mode, I can now control these parameters using these knobs. And then if I go ahead and enter the clip view, go into my envelopes, now they appear as automation destinations. So that's pretty much what I wanted to discuss around clips. Now let's talk about preferences. My recommendation to you is, unfortunately, to get familiar with the preferences, because there are a lot of decisions made here that are really important to getting Ableton Live to work the way you want. So much so that you'll want to learn the shortcut Command or Control comma to bring them up. Now, I just want to go over a few items here that I feel are important. On the look and feel page, you might want to enable multiple plugin windows and disable auto hide if that's what you want. Remember that piano plugin that I showed you before, how it conveniently disappeared? If you want it to remain active, just turn off auto hide. On the audio page, I don't know why, but sometimes some of the inputs or outputs disappear over here, and you can enable them very easily like that so that you can tap into everything your audio interface has to offer. The buffer size is also something you probably want to play with. A shorter buffer reduces latency but is more demanding on your CPU and might introduce crackling. Generally speaking, you want a small as latency as possible when playing in real time, but as your project grows and you maybe stop recording live into it, you might want to increase this to give more power to your CPU to handle other things. Also, a quick way to check if your audio interface is connected is just by clicking the test tone here. The Link MIDI tab is also an important one, unfortunately, because it's a little bit complex, but if you're working with hardware controllers, synths, or drum machines, you need to get to know this. The top part lets you configure up to 6 control surfaces that have specific scripts designed to be pre-mapped with Live, like Launchpad or this keyboard. And the bottom part lets you interact with any other MIDI hardware, including what you have scripts for. These boxes control which information is allowed to flow from your controller into Ableton Live and then from Live out to your controller, or as the case may be, your synth or a drum machine. Track means that notes can flow back and forth, so track on the input means that I can use this keyboard to play notes into Live, and enabling track on the output means that Live will be able to control your external hardware, play notes on it. Sync allows you to receive clock synth from, again, external keyboards or sequencers or drum machines, and then send out sync to them, clock sync. And then remote lets you use MIDI controllers to change parameters that aren't notes on screen here, like you saw before with the piano parameters as I change them here. And remote out works the other way around. It will let Live send indicators out to your control surface. Again, if your controller has a script associated with it, and there are quite a few of those, you don't need to worry about all this stuff, but for synths and drum machines, this is quite important. Noteworthy settings on the File and Folder tab are your ability to save the current set as the default set when you open up Live. Here's a little tip. I find the metronome to be extremely loud. What I recommend you do is, as you open up Live, just even using the default set, lower this. This is the metronome level. It's also the preview level for samples that you try out over here, but more importantly, it's the metronome level. Then just go into Preferences, into File Folder, and save it. And it will reduce the metronome levels to slightly less than ear piercing. While we're on the topic of metronome settings, I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be enabled. It's not by default, but you really want this. Enable only while recording. Okay, back to preferences. If you want to load up third-party plugins, you'll probably want to have a custom VST folder, typically on a PC. I don't know, on a Mac it just seems to work, but I do have Live running on a PC as well, and you do need to assign a VST plugin folder. The Record Warp Launch tab also has quite a few important settings. For example, I want Live to not auto-warp long samples by default. Again, that's just me. I don't want solo to be enabled by default, right? Because I want to be able to solo multiple tracks at a time, and you can't if this is like this. And then ARM exclusive is something that I change quite a lot, and I don't recommend doing it through here. A nice little trick is you can hit right-click on the ARM button and decide whether it's exclusive or not right from here. So if I want ARM to be exclusive, which means that I can only play into one track at a time, then I have it set up like this. And if I want to record multiple tracks at a time, I just disable it over here, and I'm good to go on multiple tracks. So that's pretty much the settings. Now I just want to talk about some miscellaneous random stuff that I think is important. The first is this capture button. Now, unfortunately, this isn't available in anything but Ableton Live, and I think not even Live Lite. But this is a really cool feature where you could be just noodling something, and then when you hit up on a good idea, hitting capture will basically capture your last noodle and turn it into a nice little loop. So for example, I was just noodling a bit before and then hit the capture button, and this clip came up, which is a lot of nothingness here, and then something that I kind of caught on to and liked, and I can always expand or change this loop around if it didn't capture it quite precisely. Which brings me to another nice little feature that you can right click this tiny arrow here and hit set 1 here, then your loop will at this point start wherever you want it to. Anyway, that's a nice feature. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is this info window right here. If you happen to close it, open it back up, it's really useful for hovering over various interface elements and getting a good overview of what they do as you hover on top of them. I won't cover grooves in this clip, but certainly explore that feature. Check that out in the Live manual. It's a really nice way to add variety to your music. One more little miscellaneous feature. If you're not happy with your selection of plugin or preset, you can click this little button, the Hot Swap Presets, and this will take you directly to the presets for that particular instrument. So this is reverb. If I click here, it'll take me straight to the reverbs, and I can choose and replace this with any one I want just by double clicking. Another nice miscellaneous feature is the 0 button. You use that to disable portions of your session or arrangement. Just select a clip, hit 0, and it'll quiet out. It won't delete it. It's still there, and you can always bring it back by hitting 0 again. Same thing works, by the way, for notes. Just select a note, hit 0, and it will be gone temporarily. Finally, if you're like me and you get ideas which you think are brilliant but not quite ready to develop them at that time, or they're so brilliant that you want them available in multiple tracks, you can create your own custom folders over here. This is my Brilliant Ideas folder. I won't show you what's in it, but you can just take a clip and drag it on into your Brilliant Ideas folder, and it'll stay there and be accessible for any of your projects. And this copies not just the notes, but everything else that's associated with the tracks, its devices, and so on. Another little tip that I found out quite a bit late is the fact that you don't need to replicate loops if they're the same. So let's say I've got this scene with a bass line and I want to add hi-hats to it. So it'll stop because there's a stop button here. So the way to avoid this, you'd think, is just to copy this track and paste it here, but you don't have to. You can just right click here and remove the stop button, and then this bass will play, and then whenever I want to add the hi-hats, it just won't stop. So no need to replicate stuff if it's the same. That way, if I make a change to this track and I want it to apply everywhere, I just leave it here and remove all the stops. So that's pretty much it for now. If you like these kinds of insights, I'll be adding more and more of them into my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available on Patreon. Feel free to ask me any questions below, hit like if you found this video useful, and subscribe, of course, if you want to see more. Thanks very much for watching.